Um, Welcome to our panel, History in the Fields. And I just want to, Margaret will talk a little bit about this, but I just want to give a big thank you to Carlos, who agreed to be on the panel yesterday, and Margaret, who agreed to be on the panel about 2 hours ago. And this is a little bit of the nature of the work. So I'll let Margaret address that a little bit later. I have a slideshow, so I'm going to share my screen and get started here. So this is a photo of Pindar Vineyards workers. This is the first certified bargaining unit in New York State of agricultural workers. And that in and of itself is so significant, really just so significant. So we're going to be talking a little bit today about how we got here. So I'm an associate professor of political science at Adelphi University on Long Island, which is in New York. And I've been studying farm workers in New York State since 2000. I've actually known Carlos since the early 2000s because he's been engaged with farm workers in a couple of different ways over the years. Oh, sorry, Carlos, I thought I took the senior out of that. He's an organizer at the United Food and Commercial Workers International. I wasn't sure if Yadira Vasquez was going to be here. One of the reasons she could not join us is that 4 workers were just fired, and she's meeting with the workers and trying to manage that. We assume this is some sort of retaliation. And so a big thank you to Margaret for stepping in from Local 338. So without further ado, I would like to provide some institutional context for understanding organizing farm workers in New York State. So in 2019, New York State passed the Farm Laborers Fair Labor Practices Act. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. Then I will talk about Trabajadores Agrícolas Unidos, which is the coalition of labor unions that are organizing workers, a little bit about farmer reactions, and then I'm going to discuss the Public Employees Relations Board, which is the state level organization responsible for certifying unions, dealing with unfair labor practices, etc. So the 2019 law passed, and this is so significant because at a federal level, farm workers were excluded from really important New Deal labor legislation, including the National Labor Relations Act. So they did not have a right to collective bargaining protections. And one of the ways this is really important is it meant that even if workers weren't trying to form a union, even if there were just 2 or 3 of them that went to the boss and said, hey, can we talk about our conditions? Or, hey, maybe we can get a 15-cent an hour raise. They could be fired for that. And they had no recourse because they were excluded from this law. And that's an actual example that happened in the early 2000s, where more than 40 workers were fired for asking for a very meager raise. In the end, they were all hired back except for the one who was identified as the ringleader. Farm workers were also excluded from the Fair Labor Standards Act, which means they do not have federal protections for overtime pay, nor do they have protections for a day of rest. So the 2019 FLIPA also included overtime for protections for farm workers in New York State, starting at 60 hours. And it established a wage board to decide if that threshold should stay at 60 hours or be lowered. The wage board voted to recommend going down to a 40-hour threshold over 10 years. And there's still some, we're still waiting for that officially to come out. The other thing is to recognize that most states just adopted the federal standards. And so states excluded workers from collective bargaining protections at the state level, overtime protections, day of rest, and even excluded them from state minimum wage laws. It was in 1999 that New York State farm workers became eligible to receive the state minimum wage. Before that, they had a lower minimum wage, and that's the case for many states. You're probably aware to some extent that this is an extraordinarily vulnerable workforce. It is largely made up of Latinx immigrants today in New York State, the vast majority of whom are undocumented. The official statistic is that nationwide, about 50% of farm workers are undocumented. Anecdotally in New York State, I can tell you, I think that that number is so much higher than 50%. There's another class of workers who are also very vulnerable, and those are foreign guest workers who are on an agricultural visa called the H-2A visa. And currently New York State brings in about 8,000 guest workers a year. Something else that's quite notable is that there's been an ethnic succession of workers. If you've been interested in farm worker issues in the United States, telling you that there's a Latinx farm workforce is no surprise to you. But this is actually relatively recent in New York State. So up until the early 1980s, the majority of the farm workforce in New York State were Afro-Caribbean workers and Southern Blacks and local workers. And we really start to see an ethnic shift to Latinx workers start in the 1980s. And then interestingly, it actually happens a bit later in the dairy sector, probably because those are year-round jobs. So the 2019 FLIPA was the result of a 20-year campaign called the Justice for Farm Workers campaign. This was a coalition of farm worker advocates, a lot of other nonprofits, faith groups, students, and almost every year between 1999 and 2019, there was a Farm Worker Advocacy Day, which was a day of events and marches in Albany, the state capital, and visits to talk to legislators. That campaign was happening despite the fact that you can see in the chart that the New York State Senate has largely been controlled by Republicans. And this is something that took place for more than 60 years, that Republicans held the state Senate and Democrats held the state assembly. There was a brief moment in 2008 when Democrats took control, but they were unable to pass the farm worker legislation. So what changes? So looking at the numbers, you can see a pretty significant shift to Democratic dominance. And like at the federal level, some of the newly elected folks were much more progressive than existing Democrats. There was also a rather important state court decision, Hernandez versus the state of New York. Crispin Hernandez, who's now a farm worker advocate, was a dairy worker who was fired for organizing, and the New York Civil Liberties Union took up that case. It went to appeal, and in May of 2019, about a month before the legislative session ended, the appeals court of New York State said that it was unconstitutional to exclude farm workers from collective bargaining protections. Why is this important? So the farm industry was really upset, imagining that farm workers were going to strike and that they would have the same rights as other workers. So this court decision actually brought the farm industry back to the table to negotiate around collective bargaining. Farm workers in New York State have a card check process instead of an election process, but they do not have the right to strike. And we can have a further discussion about the implications of that a little bit later. But that, in my analysis, the Hernandez decision is really important for motivating the farm industry to put some restrictions on collective bargaining and therefore agreeing to the farm worker legislation. So the Carlos and Margaret are both union organizers who are part of a statewide coalition of 3 locals and 2 internationals, and this is the logo. And these are the organizations involved. So the UFCW International, and that's who Carlos works for. Local 338, RWDSU UFCW. So UFCW is United Food and Commercial Workers. RWDSU is the, Margaret, might need help with this, Retail, Wholesale, Department Store Union. And they have a relationship with the UFCW. And that's where Margaret's from, local 338. And then you have the RWDSU International, as well as 2 other locals, 888 and UFCW Local 1. So all of these organizations had played a role in the Justice for Farm Workers campaign over the 20 years that that campaign took place. And then, in my mind, remarkably, decided to take on the challenge of organizing farm workers. And so they have been active since the fall of 2019. The law was implemented in January 1st, 2020 is when it took effect, but there were some organizers getting a head start. So as I mentioned, it's a statewide campaign focused on Long Island, the Hudson Valley, and Western New York. And of course, you know, these are separate organizations, so they divvied up the organizing both geographically and by industry. So on Long Island, both 888 and 338 are organizing. 338 is organizing the vineyards, and 888 is focused on nurseries, greenhouses, and vegetable farms. 888 also has jurisdiction in the Hudson Valley, and recently hired an organizer just about 2 months ago. So organizing in the Hudson Valley is a little bit more nascent. And Local 1 has been working in Western New York, and has had a really solid organizer out there, but there's just a lot more land to cover. So Long Island is where 2 workplaces now have certified bargaining units. And in large part because you have 2 unions out there, and also they got a little bit of a head start on the organizing. Carlos is in a unique position working for the International, that he actually travels all over the state to work with all of these organizers. In terms of the on the ground organizing, I'm going to let Carlos and Margaret talk to that. And then I also wanted to mention how important ally organizations are. So in this picture, the central figure with this billowing white dress is Noemi Sanchez. And she is the coordinator at the Long Island office of Rural Migrant Ministry. Rural Migrant Ministry has long been involved in farm worker issues, involved in the Justice for Farm Workers campaign. Carlos used to work at Rural Migrant Ministry. One of the other organizers, the one in Western New York, also worked at Rural Migrant Ministry. And so there's been a partnership between Trabajadores Agrícolas Unidas and Rural Migrant Ministry. And the idea is to try to share expertise, share outreach efforts. And in this case, I think that there's a distribution happening of masks and hygiene kits. Okay, and then Pindar Vineyards is the first union to be organized. It's now a unit of about 14 workers, and they are in contract negotiations, and I'll let Margaret talk a little bit more about that. Okay, so what have farmer reactions been? As expected, the Farm Bureau and others have been providing anti-union training by bringing in lawyers to talk to farmers and do trainings with them, largely on Zoom. We've seen a real increase in no trespassing signs going up in the fields. Before Pindar was certified, it was a lot easier for organizers to hang around the fields or to wait for workers outside the fields. But once Pindar was certified, it really put workers in a more risky position if they were seen talking with organizers. So the farmer reactions have certainly shifted some of the organizing work. We've also heard about cases where when the farmers are notified that there's a petition for a collective bargaining unit, they start interrogating their workers, which is not legal. Many workers have been asked to sign affidavits. Farmers have even had notaries standing by to disavow the union. And the reality is that workers are in such a vulnerable position that it's hard for them not to sign such documents. Okay, I would like to briefly just talk about, hold on, let me just check that. This is my last slide. So the Public Employees Relation Board, right? So this is sort of like the National Labor Relations Board, but at the state level. So clearly farm workers are not public employees, but there used to be a separate private employees relation board related to the SERA. SERA is the New York law regarding private employment. And there are some workers who fall outside of the National Labor Relations Act, for example, Catholic school teachers. But there were so few private employment cases that the private employees got folded into the PERB. When the 2019 FLIPA passed, this represented the largest increase ever in jurisdiction for the PERB. Yet the state legislature did not give them any funding to address this very significant increase in jurisdiction. So what resulted, of course, were some problems. We might talk about these as growing pains as the PERB adjusts to dealing with farm worker cases. But the problem is that growing pains sort of implies like, oh, well, everyone's just sort of getting used to it. And in fact, there have been petitions that have been removed because they were taking so long, and workers were just getting very afraid in the process. So the PERB's growing pains really negatively affected workers because of how long the process was taking. I can tell you that I don't think that the PERB leadership was intending to neglect farm workers in any way, but that there were pretty serious structural constraints for their work. Number one, again, they do almost no private employment cases. And so anybody who works in the private sector has a pretty good understanding of the sort of anti-union maneuvers that employers can engage in, right? Just think about Amazon and Bessemer. The folks who oversee the cases are called administrative law judges. And perhaps some of them just didn't have enough training about farm worker issues. So they were largely responsible for certifying unions and for adjudicating unfair labor practices. And something that the administrative law judges were doing was putting off union certification while they were dealing with unfair labor practices. And in my mind, this was actually incentivizing unfair labor practice on the part of employers, because it meant delaying the process. And with vulnerable workers, the more you delay the process, the higher chance you have that workers will get scared. In addition, the PERB has very outdated technology. So I just want to give you an example. On September 27th, the PERB board certified Pindar Vineyards bargaining unit being represented by 338. And then they wrote the letter to it and put the letter in the mail to an attorney's office. A couple days later, someone who has a lot of knowledge of the PERB and the way it works saw their minutes and saw that a union was certified, called up PERB, and he has a relationship with them. And suddenly there's a tweet out there that says the first farm worker collective bargaining unit was certified, but the union had no idea about this. So someone actually contacted me. One of the organizers said, do you know anything about this? And I knew the person who sent the tweet, and I was able to call him. But this is just one example of the outdated technology relying on snail mail. So again, largely structural issues with the problems with PERB. PERB right now has recently revised their rules, and our fingers are crossed that the revisions of the rules are going to specifically deal with farm worker issues and speeding up the process in particular. In addition to that, the PERB received $2 million from the state budget that will largely be spent on modernization practices, including almost immediately being able to submit petitions via email and having email communication for PERB decisions. So that's my effort to really just give you some background about the changes in New York State, some of the history. And then, even though there's been this wonderful law that was passed, the implementation of it being stymied because of structural problems with the Public Employees Relations Board. And I'm happy to address any questions related to this. I think I took a little bit more than 10 minutes, and I apologize for that, but I'm going to pass it over to Carlos. And Carlos, could you introduce yourself again? Because it looks like we have some new folks.
Okay. My name is Carlos Orellana. I'm an organizer with the International Union, USCW, and I have been with the union for about 15 years. So my background in organizer has been with meat packing, food production, a little bit of nursing home, hotels, supermarket, and other industries. So when I was assigned to work with the new campaign with farm workers, in the state of New York back in late 2019, and I heard about the new law and what it was included in the card check idea, and it was a little bit exciting. But on the other hand, I thought this is too good to be true, knowing in the NLRB universe how employers play with their lawyers and anti-union consultants, how they play all kind of tricks. So I was excited, but at the same time, I was a little bit cautious. So when we first started visiting the farm in early 2020 with the message, and then we got hit by pandemic, COVID-19. But our message was, there is a new law for farm workers in the state of New York. Now you have the right to unionize, and you don't have to go through an election. All you need to do, or what we need to do, is to sign the majority of the unit. If it is 10 workers, we only need to sign 6, and then you will be recognized, the union will be recognized as your legal representative. But that was the message. The time and a half after 60 hours a week, 1 day of rest mandatory by the state, in a 7 days period. And if the workers want to work their day of rest, they have to be paid time and a half. And back in January or February of 2020, PERB director and another lawyer, a couple of lawyers, they did a few like town halls across the state. I went to one of them in Middletown, New York, and I heard what he had to say, and I was like kind of I couldn't believe it, what I was hearing from him, because I coming with all my election that I had been through in the private sector, that this was going to be so easy. But anyway, time went by, and when the first petitions were filed, then that's when we hit the wall. I think something that Maggie mentioned, PERB was not prepared for it, and at the same time, they didn't have any Spanish speaking, or I don't know if they do, but I don't think they do, any Spanish speaking judges. And most of our organizers, we come from the NLRB universe, where when we have a ULP, an unfair labor practice charge, what we do is to provide the witness to the lawyer, to the agent of the NLRB, and they do most of the job. We probably write like a little brief or a description of what the charge is about, but then they take over. But with PERB, it's a whole different ballgame. We have to provide all the documentation and whatever facts, whatever happened, you have to come from us. The judges don't do any investigating or they don't spend time, finding out what really happened. So anyway, it has been a challenge. Farm workers, as Maggie was saying, the great majority, probably between 75 and 85% of the workforce is undocumented. We do get a lot of H-2A workers or visa workers who are included in the reform, in the labor law too. They have the right to be represented, but that's another challenge. Workers who come, on a 6 month or 10 months work visa, and if they try to get organized, most likely the employers won't bring them back the next year. So that's something that we have to deal with. I guess the PERB also we haven't come across that challenge or that issue yet, but that's going to be a big one. Farmers have been or did get some advice in the beginning from the Farm Bureau in the state of New York, as what to say, what to do in case your workers are trying to unionize. These are the things that you can do. These are the things that you cannot say. We heard that some of the farmers up in Western New York in the dairy farms had a meeting, the HR person ran a meeting with them and say, there's a new law and now you have the right to to have a union, to be represented by the union. It is up to you. But you need to know that unions want money and you're going to have to pay for it. It's not free. So, you know what the message the workers got about the new law and about union is that they had to pay in order to be members of the union, right? And that they were going to pay, I don't know, $20 a week, or they always, you know, employers are very smart in making the numbers higher than what they are in reality. But anyway, we, up until today, we haven't come across any worker being fired for union activity, you know, in Long Island or Western New York or the Hudson Valley. But I knew that it was going to happen. And, you know, today we got the news that something happened in Long Island. I think that farmers were very smart, you know, have been very smart. What they have done is to, and that happened to me and my coworker organizer in Western New York, and it happened in Long Island too, that what employers do in this industry, like in any other, is, you know, give workers a little bit extra money. Oh, I'm going to give you a dollar raise, and, you know, sign this paper saying that you don't want to be represented by the union anymore. I'm going to give you this and that. And workers, you know, if the majority are happy with it, they just sign the papers and they don't want to have anything to do with us. So they have been able to get away with that, some employers, and it's very hard to prove it to the pair people, because we're not going to get any witnesses saying, oh yeah, I got $2 raise from my employer, and, you know, I'm happy now, I don't want the union anymore. Nobody's going to come up and testify to that. So, but anyway, my being an organizer for so many years, and having this opportunity to organize farm workers, you know, I started getting involved in the late 80s and early 90s, you know, doing a FUCUA with farm workers through migrant ministry, doing workshops on immigration rights, civil rights, workers' rights. It was very exciting to have a new law in the state of New York. I mean, we still have a lot of work to do. I think it's a big advantage for organizers and for workers to have this new law, but there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And also the employers hire lawyers, they hire anti-union consultants. We had I had the opportunity to listen to a presentation of an anti-union consultant who came from all the way from Texas. And one of the workers recorded like 2 hours of the presentation in her cell phone. And I was exposed to it. And what was amazing, I was really like, you know, eureka, right? This guy is really smart. And what this guy was saying to the farm workers was, listen, it is not fair. This is a nursery place in Long Island. It is not fair that you guys, that, you know, 51% of you guys sign a union card and you get the union to come in here and they negotiated a contract, and because the judge, if, you know, the two parties cannot get to an agreement, an LRB assigned judge will be able to probably impose or say, this is the final, you know, thing. And this guy was saying it's not fair because those of you who didn't sign the union card or were not in favor of the union, now you're going to have to live with it. It's not fair. You should have an election. You know, everybody else has an election when they want to have a union. Why do you guys, you know, have to take it? You know, he was twisting it around, making it sound that it was not a good thing for the farm workers to have a card check neutrality, whatever, card check agreement or recognition, right? That it was better to have an election. But anyway, so we have been learning from the, I don't want to say the enemy, but from the other side of the fence. And this thing about lawyers or farmers having workers sign these affidavits in front of, you know, a public notary, I mean, that was laughable. I was laughing. I said, man, this is really naive. They're really dumb. But I guess they knew what they were doing. So the PERB took it, as an evidence that the workers didn't want to be represented anymore. And then how do you get a worker to testify on your favor when they already signed an affidavit for the employer? So they were really, and that lawyer, I think Maggie might second me on this. That lawyer, that lawyer who won the first cases is now doing, he's becoming a well-known legal representative for the next petitions for the employers who have to deal with the other petitions. But anyway, I want to give Margaret, my co-worker Margaret, the opportunity to talk. Thank you.
Thanks, Carlos. And I just also want to say, I know Margaret's not feeling well, so if you need to be short, that's fine. I just really appreciate your being here, Margaret.
Thanks so much, Maggie. Yeah, I'm Margaret Plumquist. I'm a new organizer with RWDSU, that's the Retail Wholesale Department Store Union, Local 338, based in Long Island. And yeah, I mean, I'll start, I guess, right there where Carlos left off, the way that these farmers, and I want to say too, can be really frustrating in advocacy settings, the way that these business owners they call themselves farmers, and it sort of creates this illusion of who really is doing the farm work. Because the kind of tactics that they use to scare these workers, it bleeds into every every facet of what we're doing organizing, because it is really hard to be able to reach these workers and to develop the amount of confidence that they need to stand up for themselves. And this panel itself is a little bit of a show of that, in that we had a couple of different people who I'd been talking to who were supposed to come to speak on this panel, and one was a little bit nervous to show his face still, and this is a Pindar worker who's already represented, and another had actually left the farm because the slow process of PERB has made it so that the contract negotiations at Pindar have been going on for months now, and they see their friends and family members going off to work on other vineyards in the area, where the bosses, having heard that the unions are hanging around, will offer a higher wage. And what does that mean to a worker when, even if they are represented by a union, if they have to continue to work for the minimum salary possible, when they could go somewhere and make a higher wage? Because that is what they are here to do. They're not, even if they've been living here for a long time, they want to go back and live with their families in their countries where they came from. They want to make enough money to be able to support themselves. And all of these factors coming together make it really difficult. But I'll go back to my own experience. I'm actually a new organizer with 338. I had rank and file experience with trying to organize my food production facility in Baltimore with my coworkers, that ultimately we faced a lot of the same tactics, although in a different environment, in terms of union busting. And I got to come in and work on this farm workers campaign under the tutelage of Noemi Barrera, who's the lead farm worker organizer for 338. Like Carlos was saying, this started late 2019, early 2020, coming into these farms like, we're ready to talk to people about this law, and then pandemic, and now we got to rethink how we're going about this. The beginning stages of the organizing, I know Noemi was actually finding it difficult to get into contact with a lot of the farm workers, because they understandably have it takes them a while to trust someone who's outside of the community, to trust someone who is coming in and trying to tell them to take some sort of risk. So she started she would find, soccer games maybe that workers were playing when they were off. She began teaching ESL classes out in Riverhead, Long Island, which is where the Rural Migrant Ministries is based, and slowly began making inroads into this community until, of course, reaching, a majority of workers at Pindar. And they filed, I believe they filed sometime in July. And again, it took until
May or June.
May or June. Thank you, Matt. Yeah, and then took until September for this to get certified. And, every minute of this is hard on these farm workers. This is extremely intensive physical labor, and often being away from your family, often being in really harsh conditions, and the 3 days it might take for someone to respond to an email, and then for someone to send a letter. All of this is just like these wages lost for people who are working in conditions that most workers in the United States do not really have to face because of greater protections that they have. Some of those include, even since this law went into effect, where you're supposed to get overtime after 60 hours. Nice cat, Carlos. You're supposed to get overtime after 60 hours. The bosses of the farms will rely on a lack of information dissemination amongst the farmers. So even our workers at Pindar, the whole year of 2020 were not receiving their overtime pay after 60. And it was only with like a great, amount of back and forth and us bringing them this literature so that those workers could go and show the owners, I know that this went into effect 2020. We are owed back pay, that they finally got those. That was, a couple months ago. Another thing is the lack of respect that that many workers face in the more manual sectors. A lot of our workers will say, I'd never spoken to the main owner of the vineyard, and then when the news was out with Pindar, they're starting to be like, oh, hey, how are you? It's like, you don't even know that worker's name. And other things, like if the wineries will be closed, if the farms will be closed and inside staff are given the day off, that doesn't extend to the farm workers, where under the guise of we must work with the conditions that we're given by Mother Nature, so it's demanding and it has to be now, it has to be this, but not really making any concessions for another part of Mother Nature, which is every human being and their needs, and their need to have dignity, respect, and health. At one of our more recent places that we filed for certification, there are 4 women who are working there who, besides facing all these other conditions, and that, part of this is affecting the men as well, is a lack of potable water available while they're working. These are, many farmland that these workers will be in, and there'll be one bathroom for, that takes however much time to get to, or you're expected to relieve yourself, in the woods nearby or something like that. So this just these basic rights, water, bathrooms. One of the women who just recently gave birth to a beautiful baby boy, she was asked around 6 months of her pregnancy when she was going to quit. These are just some examples of the conditions that people are working, but the reality of it is hours and hours, usually up to 60 hours, because many employers don't want to pay overtime, up to 60 hours of manual labor on your feet, sometimes around dangerous chemicals, often around dangerous machinery, is just the reality for a lot of these workers. I'm trying to see where, like, what parts I haven't brought up yet. It's definitely, it's a challenge, because it's a challenge to organize anywhere in this country, really, in these systems that are set up all over the world. But we do see that, this information is starting to get out, and that people are starting to understand that they have more of a right to organize. It's definitely been a lot of slowdowns, obstacles on many levels, in the government and per the employers, and then from farm workers who are understandably need to look out for, they're scared and they don't want to lose their livelihoods.
I think that,
Can you think
Margaret,
of
that's
anything else
great.
that
No, I think you were pretty comprehensive, and we have time for a couple of questions, I think. If anyone, Olivia or Patrick or Jennifer, if anyone has questions. Hey, Patrick.
Hi there. I'm sorry I got here late for this one, but I had a couple of questions, really. I suppose there's two parts to it. If you're looking at many agricultural products, then say, apples, then you might want a workforce for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, and then many of those workers might go on and follow the harvest onto the next crop, but not all of them. So you've got one workforce working for one employer. So you might have, as you've got it sort of defined, the bargaining unit, but then that season's over and no one's needed there until, or only a few people are needed until the next year. And so you move on to the next bargaining unit and the next farm. I guess that was one part that I was interested about. And again, when you look at different products, it seems there's a different level of urgency. So if you have an apple crop, well, you might be able to leave your apple crop on the trees for a couple of weeks without them suffering substantial damage. But if you have something like plums, then, or sort of small soft fruits, strawberries, blueberries, when they're ready, they got to come in, and they're not going to sit there and survive the animals or the seasons. So that seems to give a sort of heightened level of leverage to the workforce, possibly. Does it? I don't know. I mean, if you have cows that need to be milked, those cows aren't going to wait. So there's certain things, I suppose, about farming that make it different to other types of industry, and that there are these sort of naturally imposed deadlines that things have to be done by. I don't know. I'm just interested if this offers any sort of angle or any sort of use to it in the sort of process of organizing.
Carlos, do you want to address those questions about how many workers actually follow the harvest, and what does it mean? What kind of opportunities do workers have when the work cannot wait? It has to happen.
Well, I don't know if the question is also related, Patrick, to the power that the workers might have to go on a strike, and in this law, workers do not have the right to strike. But I think what I have found is that the workers don't move around. Like if they come to work in the apple industry, especially from overseas, that's what they do. If they come to work in the wineries or nurseries, they only do one thing at a time. They might go out to a different state, but like the dairy farms, they are year round. They don't move. They a steady job. And then the other thing is that what we know in Long Island is when the season is over, one employer has more farms down in Florida, and some of his workers go down south to work for him, and then they come back. So they move around. I don't know if you want to add anything, Maggie, but
Yeah, I mean, Patrick, I think the other strategy that I've observed is that the organizers are starting with year-round workers or workers who are most of the year. Just because, you know, trying to organize someone who's here for 2 months for the apple harvest and then they're gone and you won't see them till the next year. And like Carlos said, the apple harvesters tend to be from you know, almost a very high percent of the 8,000 guest workers who come to New York State are in the apple harvest. And even though they're here on the visa, in my experience, they are more afraid than the undocumented workers. One anecdote is that even though farm workers do not have a right to strike, there is a farm in Western New York where workers on a dairy farm walked off the job and then immediately got a raise. And that was fascinating to hear about. And, you know, yes, whether we don't know if workers are engaging in slowdowns. The other thing, like you mentioned with blueberries or strawberries or plums, is that a lot of these workers work at a piece rate. And so there's incentivized to work as fast as they can. So yeah, these are really good questions, but also part of the obstacles as well. If anybody interested, I can share a different Zoom link if anybody wants to continue the conversation. Otherwise, we only have 1 minute and we have to get off. And would anybody, I guess I'll just share it with everybody just in case. And I'll also put my email address in the Zoom chat. So I'll pop over to that Zoom. Margaret, I know you're not feeling well, and so no pressure at all, or Carlos, but if anybody wants to continue the conversation, I'll hop over to the other Zoom, and that's my email address also. And I just wanted to say thank you again to Margaret and Carlos, who really stepped in at the last minute to be on this panel. Thank you. Thanks, Jennifer. Patrick, we appreciate your question. Have a great day.